Imagine stepping into a densely packed, just sweltering tropical city of about 350,000 people.
Right.
You're a military commander and you've been tasked with taking control of this city. But there are some major catches here.
Oh, yeah. Some massive ones.
Yeah, like you aren't allowed to use artillery. You aren't allowed to call in airstrikes. And the enemy you're fighting, well, they refuse to wear uniforms.
Unbelievably difficult constraints.
Exactly. They don't just hide in houses either. I mean, they build heavily fortified concrete bunkers inside civilian living rooms, and every street, every single alleyway is rigged with improvised explosive devices.
It's a total nightmare scenario for an advancing force.
It really is. You have limited troops, a ticking clock, and a target that has defied literally every previous attempt to subdue it. So, welcome to our deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are going to act as operational art analysts and deconstruct a truly grueling military campaign based on our source material. We're looking at the capture of Jaffna by the Indian Peacekeeping Force, or the IPKF, against the LTTE in October of 1987.
Yeah, and we're going to trace the connective tissue here, right from the strategic blueprint, down into the harsh reality of force constraints.
Right. And just to be clear for our listeners, we are impartially reporting the events and viewpoints as they are laid out in the historical sources provided. We aren't endorsing any specific political sides here, just unpacking the military reality of what was recorded.
Absolutely. Our mission is to look at the brutal friction of urban execution and the profound lessons that emerged from it.
So it all really starts with a single overriding question for you, the listener. Why does capturing a symbolic center matter more than simply occupying empty territory?
That question right there. That is the master key to unlocking the logic of this entire operation. In military strategy, tracing all the way back to theorists like Karl von Clausewitz, there's this fundamental concept known as the center of gravity.
Center of gravity, like the keystone in an arch, right?
Exactly like that. Or, the king on a chessboard. It's the hub of all power and movement for a military force.
So it's the one specific entity or location that everything else relies on.
Right. If you can identify the enemy's center of gravity and shatter it, their entire capacity to resist just collapses. And in the context of the conflict in Sri Lanka in 1987, the Jaffna Peninsula wasn't just a spot on the map for the LTTE.
It was their absolute, undeniable center of gravity.
Exactly.
And when you look at the operational background from the sources, that center of gravity rests on four really distinct pillars. First, it was the political symbol of their power.
Yeah, it was the historic and cultural heartland for the Tamil population they claimed to represent.
Right, so controlling it was the literal physical manifestation of their authority. Second, it was their command center, the top leadership, the communication hubs, the planning rooms.
They were all physically located right there within this urban density.
Yeah. And third, it was a massive logistics base. We aren't just talking about like a few hidden weapons caches.
No, they had established vast training facilities, enormous arsenals. I mean, they were literally running their own ammunition-making factories right there in the city.
Wow. Ammunition factories inside the city limits. And then the fourth pillar is arguably the most resilient one, right? It was their psychological center.
Oh, absolutely. The aura of Jaffna was one of just total invincibility. Prior to the IPKF's arrival, the Sri Lankan armed forces had made multiple concerted efforts to capture Jaffna.
And the LTTE had successfully repelled them every single time.
Every time. And that creates a mythos. It creates a psychological fortress for the defenders and a deeply intimidating prospect for any attacking force.
So, for the IPKF commanders, the strategic requirement was brutally clear. You can't just nibble at the edges of an insurgency if their symbolic and literal fortress is fully intact.
Right, you can't fight a counter-guerrilla war in the jungles if the guerrillas have a sprawling urban metropolis acting as their safe haven.
And their supply depot and command hub. So to force the LTTE into the political mainstream, which was the overarching goal of the peacekeeping mandate here, the IPKF had to capture Jaffna first.
They had to wrest control of that symbol. But recognizing a center of gravity is only the first step of operational art.
Actually, dismantling it is an entirely different beast.
Yeah, it requires an operational blueprint. You have to translate that grand strategic desire to take Jaffna into a granular, synchronized mechanical plan of action.
And the initial concept of operations was prepared by the headquarters of the 54 Infantry Division, right?
Yes, and approved by the overall force commander.
Hmm.
And it was just a staggering piece of ambition. It relied on overwhelming the enemy simultaneously from multiple, unpredictable directions.
Well, If Jaffna is an urban fortress, a massive center of gravity, the IPKF clearly couldn't just, march up the main highway and politely knock on the front gate.
Right, they'd be slaughtered.
They must have planned a massive multi-directional chokehold to completely paralyze the defenses.
They did. The original blueprint had 5 massive moving components. First, they planned to capture Jaffna Town by employing multiple simultaneous thrust lines.
So we're talking about mechanized and infantry land advances from the north.
Yes, combined with air landings to drop troops behind enemy lines and a major seaborne amphibious landing to assault from the coast.
Wow, so hitting them from land, air, and sea all at once.
Exactly. Second, the plan dictated that as these spearheads advanced, they absolutely had to open and secure at least one primary axis of maintenance.
Basically securing a major road behind the advancing troops to make sure they had a continuous supply of ammo, food, and fuel.
Right. Third, any troops who advanced too far or got cut off from that road would have to be supplied by airdrops until a land route was forced open.
Which sounds incredibly risky in an urban setting.
It is. Fourth, the Indian Navy was tasked with establishing a strict, impenetrable sea blockade around the entire peninsula.
To make sure the LTTE couldn't smuggle in reinforcements or escape by boat.
Exactly. But then there is the fifth component, which fundamentally alters the nature of the entire campaign.
This is the part that is just wild to me.
Yeah, the operational orders explicitly dictated that air, naval, and artillery support were to be strictly confined to confirmed targets only.
I mean, you are launching a multi-pronged, amphibious, airborne, and mechanized assault into one of the most heavily fortified urban centers in South Asia, and you are deliberately leaving your heavy firepower on the sidelines.
Yep.
That just seems like an unbelievable contradiction. Like, why would a modern military tie its own hands like that before the first shot is even fired?
Well, it speaks to the unique, deeply compromised nature of this operation. You have to remember the context of how the IPKF actually arrived there.
Right. This was initiated as a peace mission.
Exactly. The Indian forces were there under an accord to assist the local Tamil population, to disarm militants peacefully, and to restore order.
So they were not an invading army seeking to conquer a foreign enemy.
No, they weren't. Therefore, the political and strategic mandate required preserving civilian infrastructure and maintaining the goodwill of the local population.
But the tactical reality of that mandate is just terrifying. I mean, the expected advantage is that by minimizing collateral damage, you secure the population's support and legitimize your presence.
Right.
But the tactical risk is entirely borne by the infantrymen on the ground.
100%. By self-imposing restrictions on area of effect weapons like artillery or airstrikes, you are essentially forcing your soldiers to clear heavily fortified concrete bunkers using only their personal rifles, grenades, and sheer physical courage.
You are literally trading the lives of your soldiers to preserve the physical environment.
That is the grim operational trade-off. And that trade-off becomes exponentially more dangerous when we analyze the force availability.
Yeah, let's look at the math here.
We have this grand blueprint for a massive multi-domain assault, but plans require resources. To secure an area as complex, vast, and heavily defended as the Jaffna Peninsula, military planners conducted a thorough estimate.
And what did they calculate they actually needed?
They calculated a hard requirement of 6, possibly 7, full infantry brigades just for the Jaffna sector.
Okay, so 6 or 7 brigades. But when you look at the ledger of what was actually available in the entire Sri Lankan theater at that exact moment, the math just doesn't work out at all.
Not even close.
They had 2 division headquarters, the 36th and the 54th. They had a total of 6 infantry brigades on the island. They have 1 armored regiment, 1 mechanized infantry battalion, 1 artillery regiment, and 1 para-commando battalion.
Now, 6 brigades total sounds like it almost meets the requirement, right? Until you actually look at a map.
Right, because to visualize this, you, the listener, need to establish a geographical memory map of the operational area. Picture the teardrop shape of Sri Lanka.
Up in the north, connecting the main island to the northern peninsula, is this vital, really narrow choke point called Elephant Pass.
Everything north of Elephant Pass is the Jaffna Peninsula, and this was the designated responsibility of the 54 Infantry Division.
Right, and everything south of Elephant Pass, which encompasses the massive eastern province and the vital port city of Trincomalee, that was the Trincomalee sector.
Which was the responsibility of the 36th Infantry Division.
Exactly. And dividing the area of responsibility makes complete sense for command clarity. You can't have one general trying to fight a war in two vastly different geographical zones simultaneously.
But because of the split, those 6 available brigades were completely scattered. 4 of them had been inducted by sea all the way down in Trincomalee.
Right. That means for the Jaffna sector, against a stated requirement of 6 or 7 brigades to pull off this grand blueprint, the 54 Division only had 2 brigades available initially.
The 18th and the 91st Infantry Brigades.
Yep. A third, the 72nd, was severely delayed and only kind of trickling in.
So you have a commander staring at a fortified urban center of gravity, holding a blueprint that requires a massive envelopment, but he only possesses about 30% of the required combat power.
And the impact of that on operations is profound and immediate. Because they were critically short on manpower, they had to make these dangerous, agonizing compromises.
They had to accept a massive void in the northeast and east of the Jaffna Peninsula.
Literally strip troops from those outlying areas, leaving them completely undefended, just to scrape together enough combat mass for the main assault on Jaffna town.
And when you accept a void in your rear areas, you are sacrificing your own security.
Oh, completely.
You are compromising your sustainability and your speed. Because every single mile your spearhead advances toward the city, you have to constantly look over your shoulder.
Terrified that the enemy is just going to slip into the void behind you and cut off your food and ammunition.
Right. Which brings us to one of the most studied dilemmas in operational art, which is the agony of timing.
Yeah. You have a fraction of the required troops. Your reinforcements are delayed because of what military logisticians call a multimodal transport nightmare.
Right, moving brigades by rail across India, transitioning them to commercial aircraft, loading heavy equipment onto seacraft.
A snag in a railway schedule in central India could delay a battalion arriving in Sri Lanka by days.
So, logically, conventionally, a planner should wait, right? You consolidate your perimeter, wait for your 4 missing brigades to arrive, build up overwhelming strength, and then execute the blueprint.
That's what the textbook says. But the IPKF decided they couldn't wait. They were trading their numerical advantage for speed.
But that speed meant they were running headfirst into a buzzsaw, a defense that had been preparing for this exact moment. So why make that choice? Why not just hold the line and wait for the rest of the army to show up?
Well, to understand why they didn't wait, you have to look at what the enemy was doing. If the IPKF waited, they would certainly gain mass, but they would completely forfeit the initiative.
They'd be giving the LTTE invaluable days to lay more mines, build more bunkers, and mobilize more fighters.
Exactly. But more critically, the enemy wasn't just sitting idle behind their walls. On October 10th, the LTTE commenced active, coordinated attacks on isolated IPKF outposts.
And those outposts weren't dug into defensive fighting positions, right?
Right.
They were widely dispersed because they had originally deployed for a peacekeeping role.
Yeah, they were sitting in schools and community centers. Concentrating them now while under active fire would be incredibly slow and result in heavy casualties.
But the real nightmare scenario, the thing that I imagine kept the IPKF command awake at night, was the threat to their key vulnerable areas.
Specifically the airfield at Palali and the KKS jetty. Palali wasn't just a runway. It was the central nervous system of their logistics.
It held the divisional maintenance stocks, all of their ammunition reserves, all of their aviation fuel, all of their rations were sitting right there.
Furthermore, the Sri Lankan armed forces still had camps in the area. They were extremely vulnerable. And there was a very real intelligence assessment that the LTTE was preparing to overrun them.
So imagine thousands of Indian troops suddenly stranded on a hostile peninsula. The LTTE overruns Palali.
It's game over.
Suddenly, those troops have no bullets, no bandages, no fuel for their vehicles, and absolutely no way home because the runway is gone.
That was the nightmare the commander was staring at.
Yeah.
If you lose your ammo and fuel dump, the campaign is over before it even begins.
It is the ultimate least bad option scenario.
The IPKF command realized the LTTE knew exactly how thinly spread they were. The LTTE was likely anticipating that the IPKF would hunker down and wait for reinforcements.
So the IPKF command decided to invert those expectations.
They had to act immediately. They had to launch a preemptive offensive, despite the severe resource shortage, simply to threaten Jaffna town, achieve operational surprise, and force the LTTE to pull back from the airfield.
Basically force them to focus on defending their center of gravity, so they traded mass for disruption.
Exactly.
But by taking that initiative, they were throwing those 2 understrength brigades headfirst into one of the most meticulously prepared urban defenses in modern counterinsurgency history.
Oh, absolutely not meticulously prepared. Let's really look at the anatomy of that defense.
Yeah, the sources estimate there were about 1,500 LTTE cadres in and around Jaffna initially, which was quickly reinforced to over 2,500.
And these weren't, lightly armed rebels with hunting rifles. They were a highly militarized force.
Right, 75% of them were armed with automatic weapons, like AK-47s and G3 rifles, plus a massive inventory of light and medium machine guns, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades.
And they utilized that weaponry within a brilliant spatial layout. They had designed a concentric, four-tier defense system.
To visualize this, listener, imagine a series of tightening rings, like a dartboard. The outermost ring, Tier 1, acted as the early warning and attrition layer.
Yeah. This defense ran along the geographical line of Sandipai, Chunakam, and Putter. Its purpose wasn't to stop the IPKF completely, but to act as a tripwire.
To force the advancing columns to deploy early, slow down, and take initial casualties from ambushes.
Precisely. Then you move inward to Tier 2, the intermediate defense. This line ran through Kopai North, Upumperai, Kondaville, Manapai, and Arali.
So if an attacking column manages to punch through that first outer ring, they hit this second perimeter. And here, the geography starts to work against the attacker.
The avenues of approach become narrower, the resistance becomes highly organized, and the interlocking fields of machine gun fire become much denser.
And if you survive Tier 2, you hit Tier 3, the inner defense, which runs from Navatkuli to Kopai South and straight to the coast.
This is where the urban density truly becomes a nightmare. Every building is a potential redoubt. Every rooftop is a sniper position.
And finally, if you breach that, you reach Tier 4, the urban stronghold of Jaffna town itself, the bullseye.
Every single step inward from Tier 1 to Tier 4 means denser buildings, narrower streets, a higher concentration of civilians, and exponentially greater danger for the infantry.
So to dismantle this four-ring fortress with only a fraction of the required troops, the 54 Infantry Division had to carefully phase their operations.
They devised a 5-phase offensive plan. Phase 1 was the immediate objective: capture Jaffna town using those multiple thrust lines,
while simultaneously establishing blocking positions to prevent LTTE reinforcements from flowing in from the eastern provinces.
Right. Then Phase 2 shifted focus entirely to logistics. The imperative was to open a minimum of a 2-road access from Palali Airfield all the way down to Jaffna town to ensure maintenance while clearing all the immediate outlying areas.
Okay, Phase 3 directed forces to clear the Vadmarachi Division. Phase 4 was to clear Valakmam West and the surrounding islands. And finally, Phase 5 was to clear the Tenon Marachi Division.
The verbs used in that plan tell the whole story. Phase 1 is to capture. Phases 2 through 5 are to clear.
That distinction is the difference between a battle and a grinding campaign, isn't it?
Oh, completely. Capturing an objective might just mean your armored column punches a hole through the enemy lines, reaches the town square, secures the government buildings, and raises a flag. You control the key terrain.
But clearing is a completely different doctrine.
Clearing means you have to go building by building, room by room, cellar by cellar.
You have to lift floorboards to ensure there are no hidden weapons caches. You have to secure every alleyway to ensure there are no stay-behind snipers.
You have to systematically comb through the civilian population to ensure there are no insurgents hiding among them in plain clothes. Clearing is exponentially harder, agonizingly slower, and requires vastly more manpower than capturing.
And as we know, they were already desperately short on manpower. So how does an army actually keep an operation like this breezing?
It's incredibly difficult.
Because a military campaign is a living organism, right? It requires constant nourishment. It needs literal fuel and ammunition for the physical fight. And it needs informational fuel for the command structure to make decisions.
Yeah, let's examine their lifelines and their information loops. In military logistics, there is a brutal, unforgiving formula known as the combat power equation.
Right. Combat power equals your fighting force plus continuous supply.
Exactly. You can deploy the most elite, highly trained, heavily armed soldiers in the world, but the moment they run out of bullets and drinking water, their combat power drops to absolute zero.
For the IPKF operating in the Jaffna Peninsula, their survival relied on two primary logistical nodes. Palali Airfield was the central hub for air supply and held the main divisional stocks.
And Kankasantharai, commonly referred to as KKS, was the primary hub for sea supply. Everything needed to sustain the battle flowed through those 2 points.
But having a mountain of ammunition at Palali doesn't help a soldier pinned down in Jaffna town.
Not at all.
Getting the supplies from the airfield to the front lines was a logistical nightmare. Because of the extreme manpower shortage, the IPKF couldn't afford to leave a massive, dedicated guard force behind to secure the roads.
Right, so the advancing infantry troops had to secure their own rear areas as they moved?
They had to constantly peel off sections of their own advancing force to guard the road they had just walked on to prevent the LTTE from interposing themselves and severing those maintenance axes.
It's like trying to stretch a rubber band that keeps snapping back. It slows the advance to a painful crawl.
That constant need for rearward security creates immense friction. And speaking of friction, we have to analyze the command and control structure, the speed of information.
Yeah. In modern war, decision-making superiority relies entirely on how fast accurate information moves up the chain of command and how fast actionable orders move back down.
Look at the IPKF's communication architecture based on the sources. You had the division headquarters deployed tactically on the ground in Jaffna.
Right. And when a situation developed, they had to communicate with the overall force commander, the OFC, who was situated across the Palk Strait in Madras, India.
And the OFC then had to communicate the strategic picture to Southern Command, located all the way in Pune.
And Southern Command communicated with Army headquarters in New Delhi.
I mean, that is a staggering geographical spread. You are trying to fight a fluid, minute-by-minute urban insurgency, and your decision loop spans from Delhi to Pune to Madras to Jaffna.
It's insanely slow. To try and mitigate this, the higher command instituted a system. A core group in Delhi met every single morning to analyze the previous day's events and issue strategic directions.
But more importantly, they stationed Army headquarters liaison officers right at the division headquarters on the ground to forward firsthand unfiltered information directly to the Chief of the Army Staff.
That liaison system is a clear indicator that Army headquarters recognize the fatal risk of delays inherent in that long chain of command.
They knew they needed a direct, high-speed pipeline for situational awareness.
But even with those liaison officers, the speed of information flow was constantly fighting against vast distances and the sheer unpredictable chaos of urban combat.
So we have the physical bullets, the radios, but what about the narrative? The sources mentioned the LTTE had great PR.
Oh, incredible PR. The IPKF was fighting an information war just as aggressively as a physical one, and initially they were losing it badly.
Because it's a vital aspect of modern conflict.
It is. The overall force commander actually drafted a report highlighting this severe vulnerability to higher command. He explicitly pointed out that the IPKF's public relations apparatus was entirely reactive.
Meaning an engagement would occur, the LTTE would immediately broadcast a carefully spun narrative to international media, and days later, the IPKF would issue a sterile press release trying to correct the record.
Exactly. The LTTE was proactive. They dictated the narrative terrain just as they dictated the physical terrain.
To adapt to this critical failing, the IPKF had to implement a structural change. They brought in civilian expertise.
They attached a joint secretary from the Ministry of External Affairs, a Mr. Parthasarthi, directly to the IPKF headquarters.
His sole mandate was to control the narrative, conduct daily press briefings, and ensure the Indian perspective was projected efficiently and immediately.
It is a stark realization that in counterinsurgency, a press briefing is a weapon system. If you lose the narrative, you lose the political mandate, and the war is over regardless of what happens on the ground.
Okay, so we've got the setup. The pieces are on the board. We have the blueprint, the force constraints, the 4 rings of defense, the logistics, and the PR war.
It's all there.
Let's look at what happens when the first shots are actually fired on October 11th. Let's trace the conduct of the battle timeline and watch the sheer friction of execution tear this blueprint apart.
The offensive officially kicks off on October 11th, and almost immediately, reality shatters the plan.
Right. Remember the grand multi-pronged envelopment we talked about? The plan for a massive seaborne landing to hit the LTTE from the coast?
Yeah. On day 1, the 91 Infantry Brigade is marshaled and ready to execute that amphibious landing west of Jaffna Fort.
That the operation has to be completely aborted.
Why? Because the naval assault craft, the LSTs, or landing ships, tank, which are massive vessels designed to deliver troops directly onto a beach.
They simply aren't there.
They hadn't arrived in time.
Just like that, a major enveloping maneuver, a critical thrust line designed to split the enemy's attention, just vanishes because the transport didn't arrive.
And that forces the entire burden onto the infantry pushing overland. The 18, 91, and 72 brigades begin their terrestrial advance, and instantly they hit a solid wall of resistance.
Down near the coast, the 1 Marathalite infantry attempts a tactical foray out of the Jaffna fort to link up with advancing columns. They step out of the gates and find the entire surrounding area heavily seeded with mines.
And they are immediately pinned down by intense, interlocking small arms fire raining down from the surrounding built-up areas. They can barely move.
As we transition into October 12th and 13th, the LTTE resistance doesn't just hold its ground, it violently intensifies.
Yeah, look at the operational log for the 18 Infantry Brigade's advance. Their 12 Grenadiers Battalion is ordered to move up to secure a location called Navat Kuli.
And in the course of that single movement, that battalion is ambushed 7 different times.
7 times. We need to pause and really understand what that means. Being ambushed 7 times isn't just taking scattered sniper fire.
It means every time they try to cross an intersection, a remote-controlled IED detonates, disabling their lead vehicle.
As the troops dismount to secure the perimeter, heavy machine guns open up from hidden bunkers built inside civilian living rooms.
They have to fight a brutal hour-long firefight just to clear one street corner. They treat their wounded, reform the column, move another 200 meters, and the entire nightmare repeats itself.
The resistance is so fierce, the ambush is so relentless and costly that the command is forced to halt all daytime operations. The 12 Grenadiers can only inch forward under the cover of absolute darkness.
And their sister battalion, the 4 Mehar, faces a similar crucible. As they push toward Kopai South, they suddenly find themselves taking intense, coordinated fire from 3 different directions simultaneously.
They are essentially boxed into a kill zone, fighting desperately just to survive, let alone advance.
But amidst this tactical chaos, there is a detail in the operational history that truly underscores the desperation of the IPKF's situation.
Oh, this part is wild. Right around this time, October 12th or 13th, while battalions like the Grenadiers and the Mehar are bleeding for every yard, the 54 and 36 divisions are ordered to urgently open battle schools at Palauli and Trincomalee.
I mean, the absurdity of that is staggering. A battle school is typically a pristine training environment set up weeks or months before a deployment.
Right. It's where you take your troops, acclimate them to the local weather, teach them the specific enemy tactics, run them through mock urban villages, and ensure everyone knows the playbook.
But because the IPKF was forced to act immediately to save the airfield, they completely bypassed all preparation.
They are literally flying raw, unacclimated troops from central India directly into an active war zone, handing them a rifle, giving them a hasty crash course on urban survival while artillery echoes in the background, and then shoving them straight into the meat grinder.
It is the literal definition of trying to build the airplane while you are in a nosedive.
It perfectly highlights the cascading consequences of the manpower shortage and the total lack of mobilization preparation.
But by October 15th through the 19th, the logistical pipeline finally starts delivering. The reinforcements, the 41 and 115 brigades, are inducted at Palauli.
But there is no time to hold them in reserve or let them acclimatize. They are immediately thrust into the fight to reinforce the stalled, exhausted axis of advance.
The 41 Brigade is sent pushing down the West Coast Road, and the friction is so high and the terrain so unfamiliar that at one point an entire column takes a wrong turn, has to painfully retrace its steps under threat of ambush, and keep pushing.
But despite the agonizing pace, the sheer mass of the IPKF finally begins to tell. Between October 20th and 22nd, you enter the capture phase.
The various thrust lines finally begin to converge on the city center. The 41 Brigade manages a breakthrough and links up with the forces outside Jaffna Fort on the 19th.
The other columns violently link up over the subsequent days. As the net finally closes around the center of gravity, the IPKF command tries to establish blocking positions to cut off the escape routes, particularly over the Jaffna Lagoon.
But the geography defeats them. It is simply impossible for a depleted force to completely seal off a sprawling, chaotic city of 350,000 panicking civilians.
Hundreds of seasoned LTTE cadres inevitably slip through the porous gaps, melting away into the countryside.
And it is during this chaotic final capture phase, specifically on October 21st, that we see one of the most significant, controversial, and deeply illustrative events of the entire operation.
A hospital incident.
Yeah. This incident ties everything together: the urban terrain, the ruthless tactics, and the information war. According to the operational intelligence reports from the sources, on October 21st, IPKF signals intelligence intercepted a highly revealing radio transmission.
They positively identified the voice of Mahatya, a senior and well-known LTTE commander. He was actively broadcasting orders, directing his cadres to move additional heavy mortars to the large 1,000-bed Jaffna Hospital.
In the intercept, he explicitly stated they should move the weapons there, quote, as they will be safe there.
What Mahatma was ordering is a textbook, calculated violation of the Geneva Conventions and the laws of armed conflict.
You cannot use a protected medical facility filled with vulnerable patients and doctors as a military firing position.
Exactly. The LTTE had intentionally taken shelter inside the hospital compound and were actively laying down heavy fire against advancing IPKF troops from within the wards.
And the IPKF troops, taking casualties in the open, were placed in an impossible moral and tactical dilemma. They were forced to return fire to survive, and subsequently had to storm and militarily occupy the hospital to silence the guns.
But look at the sinister brilliance of how the LTTE weaponized that exact horrific scenario. They engineered a firefight inside a hospital, knowing with absolute certainty that the IPKF would have to respond to the fire.
And the moment the IPKF stormed the building, the LTTE's PR machine went into overdrive.
They immediately publicized the exchange of fire to the international media, blanketing the airwaves with claims that Indian peacekeepers had brutally massacred innocent doctors and patients.
They completely omitted the fact that they had fired first from the wards. Even though the IPKF's own medical and engineering personnel had spent August rehabilitating that very same hospital for the community, the LTTE successfully used the incident as a massive international PR victory.
It demonstrates how, in an urban insurgency, the physical terrain and the informational terrain are the exact same battlefield.
The entire operation was a fluid, deeply chaotic environment where plans continuously morphed under the friction of reality.
Every unoccupied rear area was immediately refilled by LTTE, necessitating whole new combat operations just to clear the road behind them again.
And while that main overland advance was a brutal slog, there was one specific isolated operation during this timeline that perfectly encapsulates every single element of friction we've discussed so far.
It's a profound military tragedy, but as operational analysts, we have to dissect it to understand the reality of war. Let's look deeply at the case study of the Coqueville-Helleborn operation.
Yeah, this operation was launched right at the chaotic beginning on the night of October 12th.
The objective was highly sensitive, highly ambitious, and potentially war-winning. Headquarters 54 Infantry Division received what they believed was confirmed, actionable intelligence that the absolute top brass of the LTTE leadership was located in a specific building complex in the area of Coqueville.
Deep within the urban density, the planning assumption was bold.
Very bold. The command believed that a swift, decisive, overwhelming strike could decapitate the LTTE leadership in one night, potentially collapsing the entire resistance before the grinding street battles even began.
The plan was a classic vertical envelopment. They would use transport helicopters to insert a company of para-commandos, India's highly trained elite special forces, under the cover of darkness.
The commando's job was to secure a designated landing zone. Once secure, successive waves of helicopters would ferry in conventional infantry from the 13th Sikh Light Infantry.
The Sikh LI troops would take over the static defense of the helipad, establishing a firm base. This would free up the elite commandos to leave the LZ, navigate to the target building, execute a lightning raid to capture or kill the leadership, return to the helipad, and then hold out until the main advancing armored brigades linked up with them within 24 hours.
On a whiteboard in a command tent, it is a sound, aggressive plan, but let's look at the execution and the absolute cascade of systemic failures that doomed it.
The operation commenced in the dead of night, between 0100 and 0230 hours, but logistical constraints crippled them immediately. They only had 4 Mi-8 transport helicopters available for the entire lift.
Flying in pitch black over hostile urban terrain, they managed to make 5 initial landings, dropping off 103 para-commandos and just 30 personnel, a single platoon from the 13th Sikh LI.
And the moment boots hit the ground, the element of surprise evaporates and everything falls apart.
By the time those troops are exiting the helicopters, the landing zone is completely compromised. It is under intense intermittent fire from surrounding LTTE positions.
And despite their training, the commandos cannot locate and silence the hidden shooters in the dark.
Because of that intense ground fire, 3 of the 4 precious Mi-8 helicopters take direct hits from small arms fire.
The pilots assess the damage and the threat environment and express their inability to fly any more sorties into a hot LZ.
The command has no choice but to abruptly cancel the airlift. This means the induction is drastically incomplete.
The vast majority of the 13 Sikh ally company, the troops intended to hold the perimeter, never arrive. Only that initial isolated platoon of 30 men is left on the ground.
This is where a simple technological failure turns a dangerous tactical situation into a deadly one.
The vital information that the airlift is canceled, that no more troops are coming, absolutely needs to get to the Sikh ally platoon on the ground so they can adjust their posture.
But their radio set was damaged during the chaotic insertion. They were entirely cut off from higher command, waiting in the dark for reinforcements that are never going to arrive.
Now, the paracommandos on the ground obviously have functioning communications. They know the airlift is canceled. They're physically occupying the same general area.
They could have navigated over and informed the Sikh Allied platoon commander that they were on their own.
Furthermore, the operational plan explicitly gave the commandos the primary responsibility to ensure the helipad was secure before launching their raid. But they didn't communicate, and they didn't stay. Wait, stop. You're telling me the commandos, the most highly trained elite special forces on the battlefield, just walked away?
Yep.
How does a special forces commander justify leaving an isolated, understrength conventional platoon stranded on a hot landing zone surrounded by the enemy?
It comes down to the brutal psychology of mission focus and the unforgiving pressure of time. The operational history indicates the commandos were intensely, singularly focused on their primary strategic mission, the decapitation raid on the LTTE headquarters.
They knew daylight was rapidly approaching.
Right. Once the sun came up, sneaking 100 commandos through a hostile, densely populated city to hit a fortified headquarters would be utterly impossible.
So they made a cold, hard, utilitarian calculus. They made the fateful decision to move out and execute the raid, leaving the isolated 13 Sikh ally platoon behind to fend for themselves at the landing zone.
And to compound the tragedy, the raid itself is a total disaster. As the commandos move out into the urban maze, they encounter a local civilian.
They apprehend him, and under interrogation, he offers to guide them directly to the LTTE location. In the confusion and urgency of the night, they trust him.
And this local guide completely betrays them. He leads the elite force on a wild goose chase, deliberately steering them away from the target and into a maze of dead ends.
And while the commandos are being led in circles, that isolated platoon of 30 men from the 13 Sikh LI is left to face the full, concentrated rack in the LTTE.
When the sun comes up on October 12th, the LTTE realizes how small and vulnerable the Indian force is.
Throughout that entire day, those 30 men put up a desperate, unimaginably gallant fight. But they are completely surrounded, taking fire from all sides, with no hope of reinforcements, no close air support, and no artillery to break the siege.
The result is absolutely devastating. They fight street by street, house by house, until their ammunition completely runs out.
The operational records state that when the magazines were empty, the last 3 surviving men of the platoon fixed their bayonets and undertook a suicidal charge directly into the encircling LTTE positions.
2 were killed in action during the charge, and the final soldier was wounded and captured, though he was later released. It is a profound loss of life.
If we act as operational analysts and extract the systemic lessons from this hell-born case study, they are glaring and painful.
First, the catastrophic intelligence failure regarding the local guide. You cannot rely on unvetted locals in a hostile insurgency.
Second, the critical necessity of redundant communications. If a radio breaks on insertion, a unit cannot simply cease to exist on the command net. You need a backup system, or you must establish physical runners.
Third, the fatal breakdown in tactical coordination between special forces and conventional infantry.
And most importantly, it highlights the extreme, almost suicidal danger of conducting unsupported heliborne drops directly into the heart of an enemy-held, built-up urban center without guaranteed immediate armored link-ups.
That heliborne tragedy leads us directly to a broader, vital question about the nature of this war. It wasn't just that the helicopters got shot at. It was the specific, lethal environment they landed in.
What made fighting in the Jaffna Peninsula so uniquely difficult? To understand why brigades were stalled and platoons were wiped out, we need to deeply examine the anatomy of an urban insurgency.
To truly grasp the nightmare the IPKF faced, you have to contrast the doctrine of conventional open field battle with the reality of a 360-degree urban environment.
Right. In a conventional battle, say tank armies clashing in a desert or infantry in a forest, the threat is generally linear. It is to your front.
You dig trenches, you establish a front line, you know where the enemy's coming from, and you can direct your firepower forward.
But in an urban environment, the front line is everywhere. The threat is in the sewer system below your boots, it's behind the windows 3 stories above you, and it's in the dark alleyways beside you. It is a 360-degree, three-dimensional battle space.
And the LTTE were absolute masters at exploiting that three-dimensional space. We mentioned earlier that they fortified houses, but they didn't just stack sandbags in the windows.
They engaged in massive combat engineering. They poured concrete to build permanent, reinforced bunkers inside ordinary civilian living rooms, specifically targeting intersections and crossroads.
This made them completely invisible from the outside, nearly impregnable to the small arms fire the IPKF was restricted to using, and provided the LTTE with excellent protected fields of fire down the narrow streets.
They combined those hidden bunkers with the prolific use of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. These weren't just simple pressure mines meant to blow off a tire.
They were massive, heavy, explosive-laden devices meticulously concealed along the sides of the roads, in culverts, and under trash piles.
And they were technologically sophisticated. They were activated by a remote control, by long-wire electric currents, or by pull and pressure switches operated by a hidden observer hundreds of yards away.
When you combine concrete bunkers overlooking an intersection with command-detonated IEDs, you create a lethal, inescapable gauntlet for any advancing column.
But the physical defenses, the concrete and the explosives, are only half the story. The true horror of the Jaffna campaign lies in the opponent tactical system, how the LTTE personnel actually operated as a combat organism.
And this is where their tactics become chillingly methodical. The LTTE didn't fight as large traditional platoons. They operated in tiny, highly mobile pairs or small teams.
And they always matched a heavily armed fighter with an equal number of completely unarmed personnel.
This specific tactic is a brilliant, entirely cynical adaptation to the IPKF's restrictive rules of engagement and the international PR war.
Think of an LTTE machine gunner not as a single human soldier, but as the firing mechanism of a biological weapon system. The unarmed cadre next to him is the magazine and the armor.
During a vicious firefight, the unarmed personnel's job was to constantly resupply ammunition to the shooter. If the fighter was killed or wounded, the unarmed cadre's sole purpose was to immediately strip the weapon from the casualty and extract it.
Ensuring the IPKF could never capture LTTE weapons to prove their kills, they were also tasked with carrying away their dead and wounded to mask the true casualty figures.
And here's the truly shocking, manipulative part of that system. The operational history states that if, during a chaotic, close-quarters house clearing, the IPKF killed an LTTE fighter, and the unarmed cadre couldn't safely drag the body away, they would simply take the assault rifle, flee the scene, and leave the body of the unarmed logistics cadre behind.
Then, the LTTE propaganda machine would immediately invite local journalists to the house, point to the dead, weaponless body, and claim that the Indian Army had kicked in the door and executed an innocent civilian.
How does a young infantryman even begin to fight an enemy that weaponizes their own casualties like that?
It places an impossible, crushing psychological and tactical burden on the soldier. Every single civilian walking down the street is a potential combatant, a potential logistics carrier for an ambush, or a potential prop engineered for an information war.
It breeds deep paranoia.
Yeah.
And the LTTE compounded this paranoia with their overt tactical use of human shields.
The records note they would literally force groups of terrified civilians to walk forward toward IPKF checkpoints to present memorandums or petitions.
Once the IPKF soldiers lowered their rifles to speak with the civilians, LTTE fighters hidden within or just behind the crowd would open fire at point-blank range, killing the soldiers, and then vanish back into the alleys before the IPKF could return fire without hitting the civilians.
The soldiers were paralyzed by their own humanity. The text even mentions horrific scenarios where IPKF squads kicking down doors to clear houses were engaged by women hiding inside, or armed cadres bursting out of family structures.
It is a total nightmare scenario. The IPKF is bleeding out, fighting a well-armed, deeply entrenched enemy that refuses to wear uniforms, that uses the civilian population as both physical sandbags and propaganda tools, and that has rigged every inch of asphalt with explosives.
And yet, despite all of this agonizing friction, despite the severe manpower shortages, the daily ambushes, the lack of artillery, and the urban meat grinder, the endurance of the Indian infantry prevailed.
The multiple columns did eventually converge. By late October, after weeks of brutal combat, the physical town of Jaffna is captured.
So after all that blood and treasure, the flag is raised. Mission accomplished, right? The center of gravity has fallen, the enemy is beaten, and the troops can go home.
Any military historian or veteran will tell you that taking territory is entirely different from holding it, and it is a universal way from actually pacifying it.
This brings us to the incredibly complex post-capture phase. Once the city center was physically secured, the IPKF couldn't just rest.
They had to transition immediately into screening operations. Hundreds of thousands of local inhabitants and refugees who had fled the bombardment were starting to return to the city.
The vast majority of these displaced civilians were concentrated in the massive Nellore temple complex.
The primary goal of this massive screening operation was absolute security. The IPKF knew that LTTE cadres, having lost the conventional battle, wouldn't just surrender.
The fear was they would simply drop their rifles in an alley, change into civilian sarongs, mingle with the refugees, and infiltrate right back into the city to start a terror campaign.
But the IPKF faced a massive, crippling intelligence gap. Their own military intelligence units were largely blind in Jaffna. They were entirely unable to positively identify hardcore LTTE fighters hiding among tens of thousands of traumatized civilians.
So recognizing their blindness, they had to adapt. They started heavily utilizing informers drawn from other Tamil militant groups, rival factions that the LTTE had previously crushed or marginalized.
These informers, wearing masks to hide their identities, were brought to the checkpoints to physically point out LTTE fighters hiding in the crowds and to lead IPKF patrols to hidden underground weapons caches.
From a pure security standpoint, using rival informers is a pragmatic necessity when you lack your own intelligence network. But in the theater of the narrative war, this adaptation backfired spectacularly.
The operational sources note that Indian press correspondents, some of whom had actually been smuggled into the war zone by the LTTE's own PR wing, wildly misreported these screening operations.
They reported to the mainland that the IPKF was actively collaborating with armed militant groups, effectively painting the neutral peacekeepers as just another warring faction taking sides in a dirty civil war.
And the situation at the Nellore Temple complex perfectly encapsulates the continuing, agonizing tension between cold military necessity and humanitarian constraints.
The IPKF knew that hundreds of LTTE personnel were hiding inside the temple grounds among the refugees. A ruthless occupying army might have simply besieged the temple, cut off the water, food, and medical supplies, and starved the fighters out.
But because the IPKF maintained their humanitarian mandate, they refused to resort to such extreme measures against the civilian population.
Consequently, a large number of LTTE cadres were able to use the humanitarian aid to survive, hide their weapons, and eventually slip away into the jungles to fight another day.
Which means the triumphant capture of Jaffna Town wasn't the end of the war. It was merely the end of the conventional set-piece phase.
Recognizing this, the overall force commander issued new, sobering orders on October 24th. The mission parameters radically shifted.
The IPKF had to redeploy to physically dominate the entire peninsula, regroup to let exhausted, depleted units rest, and critically prepare their mindset and logistics for a long, grinding, multi-year counter-guerrilla phase.
This pivot from a conventional capture operation to an open-ended counterinsurgency campaign forces us to look back at everything we've discussed and synthesize the systemic, structural problems the IPKF faced.
Let's do an organic, rapid-fire retrospective of the friction points that defined this battle. First, the manpower deficit.
Right. Because the initial deployment was political, no official military mobilization was ordered before the offensive began. Routine leave and training courses continued as if it were peacetime.
As a result, the battalions ordered to assault Jaffna were generally operating at only 50% of their authorized strength. They were physically exhausted and numerically depleted before they even crossed the line of departure.
Second, the mental transition.
You cannot overstate the psychological whiplash. The IPKF arrived in Sri Lanka as proud peacekeepers, deeply briefed on maintaining a sympathetic, protective attitude towards the local Tamil population.
Forcing an 18-year-old soldier to switch in a matter of hours from a peacekeeping mindset to the, as the operational text bluntly puts it, extreme hatred and lethal aggression needed to survive close-quarters combat against an enemy using human shields took a heavy psychological toll, and that hesitation delayed their tactical effectiveness.
Third, the restricted weapons mandate. The self-imposed, politically driven restrictions on using heavy weapons, artillery, and close air support to avoid civilian casualties were incredibly noble in their intent.
But in the brutal reality of urban warfare, it was devastating. It stripped the IPKF of their primary conventional advantages, artificially leveled the playing field, and directly, predictably cost Indian soldiers their lives as they were forced to clear concrete bunkers with small arms.
Fourth, the equipment gap. We often assume the state military always outguns the insurgent, but in the tight confines of Jaffna, the LTTE was actually better equipped for the environment.
They were fighting primarily with modern assault rifles like the AK-47, which provide devastating automatic fire in urban combat. The IPKF infantry were largely equipped with a 7.62 mm SLR, a heavy long-range battle rifle that is cumbersome in a stairwell.
Furthermore, the LTTE possessed a much more agile, commercially based communication network, allowing them to coordinate ambushes far faster than the rigid military radio nets of the IPKF.
Fifth and finally, road dependency.
The Indian Army was trained and structured as a conventional mechanized force heavily reliant on massive logistical supply chains. This meant their vehicles and troops were fundamentally tied to the paved roads.
The LTTE completely understood this doctrinal limitation and focused all their defensive engineering, their bunkers, and their remote IEDs exclusively on the axes of advance.
Had the IPKF been trained, equipped, and mentally prepared for deep cross-country movement through the jungles and swamps, they could have bypassed the ambushes and struck the LTTE from unexpected vectors.
When you combine all of these systemic problems, it culminates in a stark historical reality. The Indian Army had decades of hard-won experience fighting rural, jungle-based counterinsurgencies in places like Nagaland and Mizoram.
But Jaffna was a completely different animal. This was their first time tackling a massive, well-armed, highly motivated urban insurgency embedded within a densely populated, middle-class city.
It was a brutal learning curve paid for in blood. So, to bring our operational analysis to a close, we have to evaluate the campaign against its own original metrics.
We know the original operation order from the overall force commander confidently dictated that the center of gravity, Jaffna, should be captured in 4 days.
In reality, under the crushing weight of friction, it took about 10 days of intense combat. Was that original 4-day target a total command fantasy?
Based on the deep analysis of the operational factors, the conclusion is surprising. The 4-day target was actually militarily realistic if, and it is a massive historic if, the planned resources had actually materialized.
If the naval landing ships had arrived on time to launch the amphibious envelopment, if the helicopters hadn't been grounded by ground fire, and if the full complement of 6 brigades had been available to overwhelm the defenders from day one, the IPKF likely could have shattered the 4-tier defense in 4 days.
But war rarely provides the resources you plan for. Without those essential tools, making a prepared urban fortress in 10 days, while taking massive casualties and fighting with one hand tied behind their back, is a profound testament to the sheer stubborn endurance and courage of the infantry battalions on the ground.
And what about the agonizing commander's dilemma regarding timing? Knowing with certainty that they were desperately short on troops, missing their naval transport, and lacking intelligence, was launching the offensive on October 11th the right call? Could a delay of a week or two have saved lives and made the operation smoother?
It is the hardest question to answer in hindsight, but the consensus from operational analysts is that the timing, while forcing the IPKF into a deeply disadvantaged and bloody fight, was ultimately correct.
If the commanders had delayed to build up their forces and wait for the perfect moment, the aggressive LTTE almost certainly would have launched a full-scale assault on the Palali airfield.
Losing that airfield meant losing their ammunition, their fuel, and their only logistical lifeline to India. It would have transformed a difficult battle into a catastrophic strategic defeat. They attacked prematurely, not because they were ready, but because waiting meant annihilation.
As we synthesize the timeline, the geography, and the brutal lessons of this campaign, the entire operation stands as a masterclass in the friction of war.
We started on October 11th with a blueprint that immediately fell apart when the sea landing was aborted. We saw the tragic failure of the Coqueville-Helleborn raid on the 12th.
We watched severely depleted brigades push through relentless ambushes for days, culminating in the chaotic link-ups outside the fort and the heavily manipulated hospital incident on the 21st.
And geopolitically, the map tells the story of the challenge. Elephant Pass stood as the dividing line between a force stretched too thin across Trincomalee in the south and the meat grinder of Jaffna in the north.
The IPKF's survival hung on the fragile logistical threads of Palali and KKS, while the LTTE leveraged every concrete bunker, every local guide, and every civilian in an Allure temple to fight a total war.
That brings us to the end of our operational deconstruction.
But before we leave the war room, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought, a paradox that builds on everything we've explored today, but pushes deeply into the philosophy of modern conflict. We've seen how the IPKF's strict adherence to humanitarian rules of engagement, restricting heavy weapons, refusing to starve out a temple, was their greatest tactical vulnerability.
And we've seen how the LTTE was brilliantly, ruthlessly designed to exploit those exact rules, weaponizing casualties and using human shields.
So the question is this. In an era where insurgencies deliberately use the laws of war as a shield and a weapon against state militaries, how does a modern conventional force maintain its humanity, its ethics, and its political mandate without inevitably sacrificing the lives of its own soldiers on the altar of those rules? It is a devastating paradox without an easy answer, something for you to mull over.
It is the defining, unresolved question of every modern urban counterinsurgency.
Thank you for stepping into the war room with us to explore this dense, incredible piece of history. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.